Spade Cooley, The King Who Fell from Grace, April 3, 1969. Kern County Sheriff's deputies surrounded a small house in Willow Springs, California. Inside, they found a scene that would shock the entertainment world and end one of country music's most successful careers forever. Ella Mae Cooley lay dead on the bedroom floor. Her husband, Spade Cooley, the man once crowned the king of Western swing, stood over her body with blood on his hands. Just 25 years earlier, Spade had been on top of the world. His band packed dance halls from Los Angeles to Texas. His television show reached millions of viewers every week. He was handsome, talented, and wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. But success, as Spade Cooley would learn too late, doesn't cure the darkness that lives inside a man's heart. Sometimes it only makes it worse. This is the story of how America's king of Western swing became its most notorious musical criminal. A tale of jealousy, violence, and the terrible price paid when talent and fame collide with a soul that was never meant to handle either. It's a story that country music tried to forget, but one that reveals a darker truth about the cost of stardom and the monsters that can hide behind a charming smile. Donald Clyde Cooley was born December 17, 1910, in Pack Saddle Creek, Oklahoma, though he'd later claim he was from Texas because it sounded better for his image. The youngest of 8 children, he grew up in crushing poverty during the Dust Bowl era, when hope was as scarce as rain and dreams seemed like luxuries poor folks couldn't afford. His father, John Cooley, was a part Cherokee fiddler who scraped by playing local dances and working whatever jobs he could find. His mother, Emma, took in washing and sewing to help feed the family. The Cooley house was little more than a shack, but it was filled with music. Every evening, John would pull out his fiddle and play the old mountain songs, teaching young Donald the melodies that would later make him famous. Donald showed promise early. By age 8, he was playing fiddle well enough to accompany his father at local barn dances. By 12, he was better than most grown men in the county. But it wasn't just musical talent that set him apart. Even as a child, there was something magnetic about Donald Cooley. He was handsome, charming, and possessed of a confidence that seemed almost supernatural given his circumstances. The family moved to California in 1930, part of the Great Dust Bowl migration that brought thousands of Okies west in search of a better life. They settled in Modesto, where John found work in the fields, and Donald Cooley developing his musical skills. But California also introduced the young man to something that would shape the rest of his life, the intoxicating power of being noticed. In Oklahoma, Donald had been just another poor kid with a fiddle. In California, surrounded by people who'd never heard authentic Western music played with such skill, he was something special. Dance hall owners began booking him for solo gigs, local radio stations invited him to perform, and women, lots of women, began paying attention to the tall, dark-haired fiddle player with the devil's grin. By the mid-1930s, Donald had adopted the stage name Spade Cooley and was leading his own band around the Los Angeles area. The timing couldn't have been better. Hollywood was discovering country music, and Western swing was becoming the hottest sound in Southern California. Dance halls that had once featured only big band orchestras were now booking country acts, and Spade's high-energy performances were packing venues from Bakersfield to Long Beach. In 1940, Spade married Ella Mae Evans, a sweet, quiet girl from Arkansas who'd come to California with her family during the Depression. She was beautiful in a wholesome farm girl way, with blonde hair and blue eyes that photographs loved. More importantly, she adored Spade and believed in his dream of stardom with a devotion that bordered on worship. The marriage seemed perfect from the outside. Spade was rising rapidly in the music world, and Ella Mae was the supportive wife every successful man was supposed to have. They moved into a nice house in the Hollywood Hills and began living the California dream that had drawn them west. But even then, those closest to them noticed troubling signs. Spade's temper, which he'd always been able to control in public, began emerging in private. He was possessively jealous of Ella Mae, questioning her about every conversation, every friendship, every moment spent away from him. He demanded to know where she was at all times and flew into rages if she was even minutes late returning from errands. But Ella Mae made excuses. Spade was under tremendous pressure, she'd tell concerned friends. The music business was demanding, and he was working so hard to build their future. Besides, he was always sorry afterward. He'd bring flowers, take her to nice dinners, promise it would never happen again, and for a while it wouldn't, until it did. The 1940s belonged to Spade Cooley. As America entered World War II, Western swing became the soundtrack for a nation seeking escape from global uncertainty. Spade's band, which had grown to include more than 20 musicians, was setting attendance records at dance halls throughout the West Coast. What set Spade apart from other Western swing leaders wasn't just his musical ability, though he was undeniably talented. It was his understanding of show business. While other country acts treated performances as simple music presentations, Spade created spectacles. His band wore matching outfits, his arrangements were complex and sophisticated, and Spade himself was a natural showman, working the crowd like a revival preacher and a Las Vegas entertainer rolled into one. In 1942, he landed a regular television show on KTLA in Los Angeles, making him one of the first country artists to successfully transition to the new medium. The Spade Cooley Show aired twice a week and reached hundreds of thousands of viewers across Southern California. The program showcased not just Spade's music, but his personality, and audiences fell in love with the charming, handsome bandleader who seemed to embody the American dream. The show's success led to recording contracts, movie appearances, and endorsement deals. Spade's records sold in the hundreds of thousands. His version of Shame on You became a massive hit in 1944, establishing him as a major recording artist as well as a live performer. By 1945, he was earning more money than most Hollywood movie stars. Fame suited Spade perfectly, at least in public. He was gracious with fans, generous with his time, and always ready with a smile and a joke. The press loved him, writing glowing profiles about the humble Oklahoma boy who'd made it big in California. He seemed to represent everything good about American ambition and opportunity, but success was changing Spade in ways that weren't visible to his adoring public. The money, the fame, the constant attention from women began feeding something dark inside him. He started drinking heavily, though he was careful never to appear intoxicated in public. He began having affairs, first with backup singers in his band, later with fans and anyone else who caught his eye. Most troubling, his treatment of Ella May grew increasingly erratic and controlling. He hired private investigators to follow her when he was on the road. He installed locks on the house that only he had keys to. He began accusing her of infidelity, despite having no evidence, and his accusations were often followed by physical violence that left Ella May wearing long sleeves and heavy makeup to cover the bruises. Ella May's friends urged her to leave, but she refused. She still loved the man she'd married, she insisted. This wasn't the real Spade, just the pressure and stress talking. Besides, where would she go? Spade controlled all their finances, all their social connections. She was trapped in a gilded cage, and the cage was getting smaller every year. By 1950, Spade Cooley was at the absolute peak of his career. His television show was the highest-rated program on KTLA. His band was booked solid for months in advance. He'd been named King of Western Swing by music industry publications, a title he wore with obvious pride. But beneath the crown, the man was slowly going insane. The 1950s marked the beginning of Spade's descent from beloved entertainer to dangerous predator. As rock and roll began changing American popular music, Western swing's popularity started to decline. Dance halls that had once been packed for Spade's performances were now booking younger acts with electric guitars and drums. His television ratings began to slip as viewers discovered new forms of entertainment. For a man who'd built his entire identity around being adored by crowds, the slow fade from relevance was devastating. Spade began drinking more heavily and staying out later after performances. The affairs became more frequent and less discreet. Several women who worked with the band later reported that Spade had forced himself on them, using his position of power to coerce sexual encounters, but it was Ella May who bore the brunt of his increasing instability. The physical abuse escalated from occasional slaps during arguments to systematic beatings that left her hospitalized on multiple occasions. Spade's paranoia about her faithfulness reached delusional levels. He accused her of having affairs with band members, television executives, neighbors, and random strangers she'd never even spoken to. The couple's children, Melody and John, lived in constant fear of their father's rages. Both would later testify about nights spent hiding in their bedrooms while Spade screamed accusations at their mother, and the sounds of violence echoed through the house. The family that had once seemed like a fairy tale had become a nightmare. Ella May tried to leave several times during the 1950s, but Spade always found her. He'd promised to change, undergo therapy, stop drinking, anything to get her back, and when sweet words didn't work, he'd resort to threats. He knew people. He'd tell her she'd never be safe anywhere if she tried to leave him permanently. Meanwhile, Spade's professional life continued its slow decline. By the late 1950s, his television show had been cancelled. His record sales had dropped to almost nothing. The dance halls that had once competed for his services now offered him fraction of his former fees, if they called at all. The loss of fame hit Spade harder than anyone close to him had anticipated. For nearly 20 years, he'd been accustomed to constant adulation, to being recognized everywhere he went, to feeling like he was special. Now he was just another aging musician whose time had passed, and the reality was more than his ego could handle. He began blaming everyone around him for his career problems. The record companies didn't understand his music. Television executives were conspiring against him, and Ella May, he convinced himself, was somehow sabotaging his comeback attempts. His paranoid delusions about her infidelity merged with his professional frustrations into a toxic mixture that made him increasingly dangerous to be around. By 1960, Spade was performing mainly at small clubs and private parties, a far cry from the packed venues of his heyday. He'd gained weight, lost much of his hair, and developed the bloated, reddened face of a chronic alcoholic. But he still possessed enough of his old charisma to convince people he was just going through a rough patch, that his comeback was right around the corner. The 1960s began with what seemed like a glimmer of hope for Spade's career. A small resurgence of interest in Western swing music brought him a few recording opportunities and some better-paying gigs. For a brief moment, it looked like he might reclaim at least some of his former success. But the brief upturn only made Spade's underlying problems worse. Any reminder of his former fame sent him into cycles of grandiosity, followed by crushing depression. He'd spend days plotting elaborate comebacks, then weeks convinced that everyone in the music industry was working against him. The drinking increased, and with it, the violence toward Ella May. Friends and family members who witnessed Spade's behavior during this period later described a man who seemed to be losing his grip on reality. He'd fly into rages over imagined slights, convinced that people were staring at him or talking about him behind his back. He became obsessed with perceived enemies and began carrying weapons, claiming he needed protection from people who wanted to destroy his career. Ella May, now in her 40s and worn down by decades of abuse, was a shadow of the vibrant young woman she'd once been. She'd lost weight, developed a nervous stutter, and spent most of her time at home, afraid to go out in public where she might encounter someone who would report back to Spade about her activities. Several times during the early 1960s, police were called to the Cooley home by neighbors who heard screaming and sounds of violence. Each time, Spade would charm the officers with stories about his career, while Ella May stood silently nearby, too frightened to contradict whatever version of events he presented. The officers, many of whom remembered Spade from his television days, usually left without filing charges. In 1963, Ella May finally found the courage to file for divorce. The proceedings were bitter and public, with Spade contesting every detail and accusing Ella May of trying to destroy him financially. He represented himself in court and used the proceedings as a platform to air his grievances against everyone he felt had wronged him throughout his career. But even with a divorce decree, Spade wouldn't let go. He continued showing up at Ella May's apartment, calling her constantly, and threatening anyone who tried to help her build a new life. The divorce had been finalized, but in Spade's mind, Ella May still belonged to him. By the late 1960s, Spade was performing mainly at small clubs and VFW halls, often for audiences who had no idea who he'd once been. The few people who remembered his heyday treated him with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. The king of Western swing had become a pathetic has-been, drunk and bitter, and increasingly disconnected from reality, but he still had his obsession with Ella May. Even years after their divorce, he continued stalking her, showing up at her workplace, following her on dates, making her life miserable. She'd moved several times, but he always found her. She'd gotten restraining orders, but he ignored them. She was trapped as surely as if she'd never left him at all. The end came on a warm spring evening in Willow Springs, a small town in Kern County, where Ella May had been living quietly, hoping Spade had finally forgotten about her. She'd been divorced from him for 6 years and had managed to build a modest but peaceful life. She had a job at a local diner, a few friends who didn't know about her past, and for the first time in decades, she felt safe, but Spade had found her again. He'd been watching her house, learning her routines, planning what he would later claim was supposed to be a reconciliation attempt. On the afternoon of April 3rd, he forced his way into her home while she was preparing dinner. What happened next was pieced together from physical evidence and Spade's own contradictory confessions. According to his initial statement to police, he'd only wanted to talk to Ella May, to convince her to give their marriage another try. But Ella May had refused, telling him she'd finally found happiness and never wanted to see him again. The rejection sent Spade into a rage that had been building for years. All the professional failures, all the public humiliation, all the loneliness and bitterness and self-loathing that he'd been carrying around crystallized into pure fury, directed at the woman who dared to leave him. He began by hitting her with his fists, but that wasn't enough. He grabbed a lamp from a nearby table and struck her repeatedly. When she fell to the floor, he continued beating her with whatever objects he could find. The attack was so violent that investigators later said it was a miracle Ella May had lived as long as she did. When neighbors finally called police after hearing screams from the Cooley house, they found Spade sitting calmly in the living room, still covered in Ella May's blood. He seemed surprised to see the officers, as if he hadn't expected there to be consequences for what he'd done. Ella May was rushed to the hospital, but died from her injuries 2 hours later. At first, Spade tried to claim he'd found Ella May already injured, suggesting that burglars had attacked her. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and there were no signs of forced entry. When confronted with the facts, he broke down and confessed, though he continued to insist that he'd never meant to kill her, that it had been an accident born of passion and frustration. The arrest made national news. The former king of Western swing, the man who'd once been one of America's most popular entertainers, was now facing murder charges. The contrast between his former fame and current notoriety was stark, and the media coverage was extensive and largely unsympathetic. Spade Cooley's trial began in October 1969, 6 months after Ella May's murder. The prosecution painted a picture of a man whose jealousy and need for control had driven him to kill the woman he claimed to love. They presented evidence of decades of abuse, testimony from friends and family members about Spade's violent behavior, and medical evidence showing the horrific extent of Ella May's injuries. The defense tried to portray Spade as a man driven to temporary insanity by professional failures and personal disappointments. They argued that he'd been drinking heavily on the day of the murder and wasn't in control of his actions. Several character witnesses testified about his former generosity and charm, painting him as a good man who'd lost his way, but the evidence was overwhelming. Ella May's children testified about the years of abuse they'd witnessed. Former band members described Spade's increasingly erratic behavior and violent temper. Medical experts explained that the severity of Ella May's injuries indicated prolonged, deliberate violence rather than a momentary loss of control. Spade himself took the stand in his own defense, a decision that proved disastrous. Under cross-examination, he revealed the depth of his narcissism and lack of genuine remorse. He spoke more about his lost career and public humiliation than about Ella May's suffering. When pressed about the abuse allegations, he claimed that Ella May had been a difficult woman who'd driven him to violence through her own behavior. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Spade to life in prison, noting that the defendant had shown no genuine remorse for his actions and posed a continuing danger to society. As he was led away in shackles, Spade seemed more concerned about how the conviction would affect his legacy than about spending the rest of his life in prison. He told reporters that he'd been railroaded by a system that wanted to destroy him, that Ella May's death had been a tragic accident, and that history would vindicate him. Spade Cooley entered Vacaville State Prison in November 1969, trading his rhinestone suits for prison stripes and his adoring crowds for fellow inmates who had no interest in his former fame. Prison was a harsh adjustment for a man who'd spent decades being catered to and celebrated. At first, he tried to maintain his public persona, telling anyone who would listen about his career and insisting that his conviction had been a miscarriage of justice. But his fellow inmates quickly grew tired of his self-pity and grandiose stories. Several fights and one serious beating taught him to keep his mouth shut about his past. The reality of prison life hit Spade harder than anyone had expected. He was nearly 60 years old, overweight, and in poor health from decades of heavy drinking. The structured routine, poor food, and constant tension took a severe toll on his physical and mental condition. He aged rapidly, losing most of his remaining hair and developing the shuffling gait and vacant stare of a broken man. He spent most of his time in the prison library, reading old entertainment magazines and newspaper clippings about his career. Guards reported that he would sit for hours staring at photographs of himself from his heyday, occasionally crying or muttering to himself. He wrote dozens of letters to music industry executives, begging for help with his appeal and promising to make a comeback if he were released. The appeals process was lengthy but ultimately futile. Spade's lawyers argued ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and judicial bias, but higher courts found no grounds for overturning his conviction. Each failed appeal seemed to break something else inside him, and his mental state continued to deteriorate. By the mid-1970s, Spade had become a model prisoner, mainly because he lacked the energy and will to cause trouble. He worked in the prison kitchen, attended mandatory counseling sessions, and kept to himself. Psychologists who evaluated him noted that he seemed to be retreating into an elaborate fantasy world where he was still a star, and Ella Mae's death had been a terrible misunderstanding. On November 23, 1969, just 8 months after beginning his sentence, Spade Cooley collapsed while working in the kitchen. Guards rushed him to the prison infirmary, where doctors determined he'd suffered a massive heart attack. He died 2 hours later without regaining consciousness. He was 58 years old and had served less than a year of his life sentence. His death certificate listed the cause as cardiac arrest, but those who knew him believed he'd simply lost the will to live once he realized that his career, his fame, and his freedom were all gone forever. Spade Cooley's death brought little mourning from the music industry or the public. His former fans had long since moved on to other entertainers, and his crime had permanently stained whatever positive memories people might have retained about his music. The few obituaries that appeared focused more on his conviction than his career achievements. His surviving family members tried to salvage something from his reputation, arguing that he should be remembered for his musical contributions rather than his final crime. But the effort was largely unsuccessful. The murder of Ella Mae had been too brutal and too well publicized for anyone to separate the artist from the criminal. Country music as an industry essentially erased Spade Cooley from its official history. His records were pulled from circulation, his name was removed from music encyclopedia entries, and his contributions to Western swing were credited to other artists. It was as if the industry had decided that some stains were too dark to be cleaned away by the passage of time. The few musicians who had worked with Spade spoke reluctantly about their experiences, usually emphasizing that they'd seen no signs of the violence that had ultimately destroyed him. Most claimed to be shocked by the revelations about his treatment of Ella Mae, though several later admitted they'd witnessed enough to suspect that something was wrong in the Cooley household. Ella Mae was buried in a small cemetery in Bakersfield, her grave marked only with her name and dates. She was 48 years old when she died, and those who knew her said she'd never had a chance to fully recover from the decades of abuse she'd endured. Her children, both adults by then, struggled to rebuild their lives while carrying the burden of their family's notoriety. The Spade Cooley case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked fame and power, but it was a lesson that the entertainment industry seemed reluctant to learn. In the decades that followed, similar patterns would emerge with other performers who used their celebrity status to abuse those around them. Music historians who studied the case noted troubling parallels between Spade's behavior and that of other performers from his era. The culture of celebrity worship that had developed around popular entertainers often enabled abusive behavior by making it easy for stars to silence their victims and avoid consequences for their actions. Ella Mae's story also highlighted the particular vulnerability of women in the entertainment industry, especially wives and girlfriends of male performers. Without independent careers or financial resources, they were often trapped in abusive relationships by economic necessity and social expectations about marriage and loyalty. The few advocates who tried to use Spade's case to raise awareness about domestic violence found little support from an industry that preferred to keep such unpleasant realities private. It would be decades before the entertainment world would begin seriously addressing the culture of abuse that had enabled performers like Spade Cooley to terrorize their victims with impunity. Today, more than 50 years after his death, Spade Cooley remains a largely forgotten figure in country music history. His contributions to Western swing have been overshadowed by his crime, and few young musicians even know his name. The records that once made him famous are collector's items found mainly in the archives of music historians and the collections of specialists in the genre. Perhaps that's as it should be. Spade Cooley was undeniably talented, and his musical innovations influenced a generation of performers. But talent doesn't excuse murder, and fame doesn't justify abuse. The entertainment industry's decision to erase him from its official history might be the only form of justice that Ella Mae Cooley ever received. The tragedy of Spade Cooley wasn't just that a man threw away a successful career and destroyed his family through violence and jealousy. It was that he represented a darker truth about the cost of fame and the monsters that can hide behind public personas. His story serves as a reminder that the applause of crowds can never fill the emptiness in a damaged soul, and that sometimes the most charming smiles hide the most dangerous hearts. In the end, Spade Cooley got exactly what his actions deserved, not martyrdom or romantic tragedy, but simple, ignoble erasure from the history he'd once hoped to shape. His victims deserved better, his music deserved better, and the industry that created him deserved to learn from his example. But forgetting Spade Cooley entirely would be a mistake, because his story contains lessons that remain relevant today. The entertainment industry still produces charismatic figures who abuse their power. Vulnerable people still find themselves trapped by famous partners who use their celebrity status to control and intimidate. And society still struggles with how to balance artistic achievement against personal behavior when evaluating a person's legacy. Spade Cooley's reign as the king of Western swing lasted barely a decade. His infamy as a murderer has lasted more than 50 years. In the end, that may be the only crown he truly earned.